Vena with Moor Insights Strategy. Welcome to our initial podcast where we discuss very relevant and topical issues in the news today. I've got a couple of folks on the Moor Insights Strategy team, Will Townsend and Anshel. Guys, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Hey, Mark. Will here. So for the firm, I cover wireless infrastructure, carrier services, and enterprise networking.
Great.
And I'm Anshel. I cover a lot of the consumer things that we do. I cover smartphones, PCs, gaming focused, and I also cover AR and VR as well as wireless communications, specifically 5G and Wi-Fi. Great.
Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for the podcast. Lots of things going on in the news today, even especially this week. And I can't resist teeing up the first topic that I think is on everyone's mind. There's already been a lot of coverage about it in the news, but I got to get the opinions of my illustrious partners here. So let's talk a little bit about Mark Zuckerberg's congressional testimony and just in general, I guess the Facebook issue, privacy issues that the company is facing. So let me turn to Anshel and get his perspective on, first of all, how do you think Mark did in front of Congress?
So I think he actually did pretty well, and I think part of the reason why he did pretty well is because I feel like the congressional members were not necessarily well prepared. I think that their staffers tried to, propose questions that would be contentious. But the reality is that because of a lack of education from our elected representatives, they weren't able to ask the really hard questions. And most of the questions that were asked were either deflected fairly effectively or didn't really get to the root of the issue. And ultimately, I think, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg did a pretty good job of preparing for this. And he didn't come off necessarily as flustered, but there were definitely some people who, made fun of some of the things that happened during his appearance. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I think, it could have been much worse. And I think that overall it was handled quite well. And I think there's still some serious issues that need to be addressed, but I think someone else needs to be in charge of asking these questions. Maybe we need somebody who oversees these kinds of things that actually has the knowledge, because right now it doesn't seem like our elected representatives do.
That's very interesting. I mean, my takeaway on it was I agree with Anshel. I think that he actually did a pretty good job. He didn't, if you recall a few years ago, he appeared in front of Walt Mossberg and Kara Swisher at Recode, and it was kind of the perspiration interview where, sweat was literally dripping from his face. So from that regard, I think he was very well prepared. He was very deferential, which is, I think, what they were trying to achieve. And the only thing that I struggled with, and I agree with Anshel's comments, is that when you have an audience of older politicians, and many of them were very old, who some of them probably don't even use Facebook, even though Facebook skews to an older audience. They were just kind of spoon-feeding questions they were getting from their staffs. The one thing that I was particularly curious about is that there was not a lot of pressure placed upon Zuckerberg on explaining whether they would change their business model. Meaning that, Anshel, you and I spoke about this a few weeks ago, in that if they were to offer some type of complete opt-out model where you paid, let's say, $40 a year, something that was very reasonable, and you couldn't participate in any ads, they couldn't scan your messages for keywords to do digital advertising on, it was a complete lockdown. You were really using the tool purely to communicate with other people. I really think that would probably hit them in a very negative way, because I think a substantial portion, not all of them, but I think a very significant portion of their user base would flip over to a paid model, and the math doesn't work. You would see profitability probably drop dramatically. So I'm really surprised that they didn't because when they got there was I forget which senator asked the question, but he kind of deferred a lot of those questions. He really didn't want to get into the meat of it because certainly I don't think they want to do that. I think that you'll have to put a gun to their heads, frankly, for them to change their model to anything that they have today. So, Will, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree. I mean, you and Anshel both make some really salient comments. I watched the live feed as well, and another senator proposed an interesting measure. Why not prevent the targeting and scraping of data, for minors? So, you can get a Facebook account when you're 13. So his proposal was, until you turn 18, for those individuals, for those minors, do that as well. So I think that would show, some compromise from Mr. Zuckerberg if he did something around, kind of addressing the minors. And I think to your point, Mark, offering an option where people could pay, but completely opt out and not participate in the scraping and the data, in the ad targeting, that sort of thing. I think that would address a lot of concerns.
I think it would address a lot of concerns. The challenge you have is that I haven't climbed into their financials, but I guarantee you, and Anshel might have a thought. Anshel might have a thought on this. Let's say they were going to charge a person $50 to be in a complete lockdown, privacy-oriented type of model. I guarantee you that if you're an active user on Facebook, meaning that you access it, multiple times during the day, which many users do, they make a lot more than $50 per person, per Facebook user.
Sure.
And it would be hard for them to make up that revenue. I mean, Anshel, what are your thoughts from the business model angle?
I don't think their ARPU is, $50 per user, because they do have billions of users. But I would say that I think the biggest threats to their business model are limiting themselves in terms of overall population. So not having, people under the age of 18, that's a problem, right? Because those are future users. You want young users so that you have growth, which is why things like Instagram are so popular, are so popular, is because the youth are on it. And the other thing is data scraping and data gathering is core to their business, and any limitation in that is going to be a limitation of their business's profitability. And I think ultimately this could have all been prevented if Facebook had been more protective of their data that they gather, and basically making it harder for companies to actually use the data that Facebook gathers. So instead of Facebook giving them the information, they give them the data, which I think is a mistake. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think you have companies like Google who are extremely protective of their data. And this isn't an issue for Google because they protect all their data. They give you access to the information, but you don't get to touch the data. And that's the difference. And I think Facebook made that mistake, and now they're paying for it.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. And and as I mentioned to both of you before, the area of coverage that I have, and it's a segment I think that's very, very interesting, is that what you're starting to see on the market today are these brand new smart home security solutions. Cherry is a good example. I had a meeting yesterday with Lighthouse, or another startup in the Bay Area that has a really interesting product that uses a time-of-flight sensor that provides tremendous data on the activity that goes on inside the house. And the reason why this is kind of relevant to the conversation we're having is that you're going to see a wave of these products over the next several years, not with simple home security products, which are kind of binary in nature. That when you come home at night, it knows it's a body or an object past a sensor and something happens. These new home security 2.0 solutions will be using machine learning and smart algorithms and all kinds of new capabilities that are derived from these highly, very high resolution sensors that are now coming to market, that you'll be able to detect, with specificity, hey, Will Townsend or Anshel Sag, walked into my house. It can actually identify who you are. And it's got some great, promise, products like that. Frankly, for people who are, the elderly that are living in place in people's homes, for example. You want to be able to monitor a situation where you want to make a distinction between a dog walking past a sensor and something, or someone falling out of their bed, for example, and you get an alert based on that. So there's really some great promise in those type of capabilities, but it raises a lot of privacy issues in that, is that data going to be encrypted? Where is it going to be stored? The companies that are coming up, bringing these products to market, are they being managed by personnel that have the best interest of people who are going to be using the products? Are they being funded by entities outside the United States and not your typical venture capital funding points? So I think those are the kind of things that that we're going to have to really start to grapple with as these products come to market, because I can assure you, I saw this Lighthouse solution yesterday, and it was very, very cool of some of the capability it can do. But these privacy issues are not going to go away, and I think that from a Facebook standpoint, in the testimony, I think it was entertaining television, certainly, but I don't think we got any closer to closure on the thorny issues that were raised. But let's talk a little bit about, though, another issue that I know that's close to Anshel's heart, and that is the rumors over the last couple of weeks of Apple potentially jettisoning Intel for processors in their products. Now, it's really rumors so far. I think it was a Bloomberg report that brought this information to the forefront, and Apple hasn't confirmed anything. But I'd like to get Anshel's perspective on that.
Sure. When it comes to Apple jettisoning Intel, this has kind of been something that's been talked about for quite some time, and the rumor has come and gone, and without much material difference to what's actually happened. And I think the reality is this has been something that Apple's been working on in terms of software development and enablement for quite some time. And I think ultimately the final result is that you will probably see Intel start to wane in Apple's overall utilization of their products. But I think you're only going to see this happen at least in the short term, or initially, you're only going to see it in the lower power products. So I don't think you're going to see like a MacBook Pro switching away from Intel, but I think you're going to see the MacBook Air and the MacBook, because I've talked to some people who have been running benchmarks, and some of the software that they make, they test on both iPad and they test on MacBook, and they're like, yeah, it runs faster on the newest iPad than it does on my MacBook. So there's definitely the if you look at the Apple SoC, you can definitely expect to see low power, ultra portable notebooks probably transition to Apple relatively soon. It just comes down to the software at this point. And then I think that maybe in the long-term future, it's possible more high-power Apple products could go to Apple SoCs, but just because of the scale of Apple's business and the way it works, it doesn't really make financial sense for Apple to invest in new ARM SoCs for higher-end processors if the laptops like the MacBook Pro and their desktops like the iMac are so low volume relative to the iPad and to the iPhone that it doesn't amortize itself across volume like it would on these higher volume products. So I just don't see Apple seeing a financial reason to switch anything that's really high power, high performance away from Intel.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that, Anshel, you're right about one thing, is that the pure revenue impact to Intel, under your scenario is really probably not that substantial. It's a prestige hit probably in the media, that will probably over-exaggerate the revenue loss that even Intel might appreciate if something like this were to happen. But, the thing that to me is interesting about this is, Apple Apple is your typical American company. They take a very long view of some of the technology decisions they make. And, there's been a lot of talk about merging the iOS code base plus Mac OS. And if you do that, you can get iOS applications to run on the desktop. And there's certainly, I think a lot of users would benefit from that if that were to fall out of this, decision. Them to do that, there certainly would be a boon for developers, because developers don't like to write an application for multiple different operating system platforms. So that might even fall out. There might be some benefits that come out of that as well. So it'll be interesting to see that the way this kind of plays out. Do you think, Anshel, that there's a Chromebook defense component tied to this? Maybe the reason why Apple wants to do this is that they, as kind of a defense mechanism against the growing sophistication and the growing capabilities of Chromebook-based notebooks. What are your thoughts connected to that element of the discussion?
I think, from what I can see here, from what I've seen in the market, when Apple announced their when they announced their iPad for education, it seemed like everybody's response was a Chromebook. So I'm not sure Apple needs a response to the Chromebook. Maybe that education iPad was their response to the Chromebook.
Right.
I'm not entirely sure, but I don't see them building a laptop that's low cost. Because once again, it's a lot easier to build a low-cost tablet and say, okay, we sell this SoC 100 million times a year. We can build this SoC relatively cheaply. But if they built a separate product out for education, it's going to be harder unless they have volume. So I think, that's why you see them using this iPad as their education solution, maybe their Chromebook answer, because it's, utilizing their most efficient supply chain.
Interesting. That's very, very interesting. So let's shift gears to a topic that I know is near and dear to Will's area, and that is 5G, which he obviously covers very extensively for Moor Insights and Strategy. And I know he wants to talk. You have some very, very interesting comments on what's happening in Europe related to 5G. But let's just get an overview of your thoughts and just some 5G in general and how things are going. Will?
Well, so I recently published an article on Forbes, and Anshel and I typically tag team on a lot of this, as well as our areas of focus are shared at times. But Mobile World Congress, start with the U.S., all of the U.S. carriers announced very, very bold plans, around 5G. Surprisingly, Sprint's been a laggard. They've suffered from, network inconsistency from a quality of service perspective. But since Marcelo Clary has been on board, the company's really turned things around. And what's interesting, they will actually be, leveraging massive MIMO technology. They will be first to market. They'll be lighting up 3 major metropolitan areas later this month into the month of May, and that'll be followed in the fall by 3 more. And so, very, very aggressive, timelines there. Certainly AT&T and, T-Mobile and Verizon are also announcing plans and deployment and that sort of thing. But, I find it's interesting that Sprint appears to have, a slight lead. That might be in part to their sole focus on mobile 5G, whereas the other carriers are deploying a mix of both fixed and mobile, and fixed really for the application of that last mile to the home for content delivery.
Now, and so related to the Europe piece and the slow rollout dimension, do you think that could change, or do you think that just a fait accompli is that Europe is going to be behind other parts of the world in terms of the way that it gets rolled out?
Well, one of the challenges in Europe is that they're still figuring out spectrum, and the auctions are still occurring. And if you recall, the FCC had a huge auction last year. T-Mobile really, swooped in and took a lot of spectrum. Sprint's got already a pretty great position with a wide band of spectrum. So Europe is still figuring that one out. The operators over there have also been resident, so they're sort of taking a wait and see approach. I believe they're a little more conservative. They want the use cases to prove out the monetization. And as a result, you're seeing very aggressive, deployments in the U.S. You're seeing that in China as well, in other parts of Asia. But, it's interesting that a Qualcomm executive last week sort of came to the defense of the European region. And that's for obvious reasons, because Qualcomm, and Anshel can address this because he covers Qualcomm quite extensively. but they have a vested interest, obviously, because they're providing the silicon and the radios and those solutions that are behind 5G as well. But I did find it interesting that the lead for Qualcomm Europe kind of came to the defense of Europe and said they're very bullish on the market, and I think that was an attempt to try to pull along Orange and Deutsche Telekom and Vodafone along.
Well, here's a topic that I know that, Anshel, you have quite a few opinions about. Will, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well. And, over the last couple of weeks, there's been some very high-profile accidents regarding self-driving cars. And, so the question I have for each of you, and we'll start with Anshel, is the media overhyping these car accidents? And again, I want to be careful not to say that even when I ask that question, that I'm indifferent to human life. Human life is extremely important, and we should strive to always, with whatever technology endeavor we undertake, we should be mindful of trying to protect human life. But having said that, is the media overhyping what's been happening over the last couple of weeks? So I'd like to get Anshel's point of view on that.
Well, I think there's definitely. It's rare for the media as a whole not to overhype something, especially when, the death of someone is involved. The reality is that deaths are always an unfortunate reality of the world, and we should always do everything we can to prevent them at all costs. And that's why I think that, we should actually look back and make sure that we're not overreacting to these crashes, because tens of thousands of people die every year in car crashes, and I strongly believe that self-driving cars are going to help bring that number near zero. And I think the more autonomy we have in cars is only going to make them more safe. And I think we talked about this earlier offline, but I think a good illusion is flying. Flying is extremely safe because it's mostly autonomous. Mm-hmm. And I think that as we bring more autonomy to vehicles with even more intelligence and more intercommunication between them, like with cellular V2X, I think you're going to see some really amazing things happen, and people are it's going to start saving lives. And
right.
I think it'll be very, very drastic, and I think it'll be very easy to measure. And, I just hope we get there sooner rather than later. Right.
Will, your thoughts?
From my perspective, Tesla is taking a different approach. They're basically building their self-driving solution from the ground up versus, leveraging quote unquote industry standard technologies out there. So, I believe their learning curve is going to be a little bit higher. I believe it's Elon Musk's, notion to be fully integrated, from a supply chain perspective. But, to Anshel's point, there are, unfortunately, automobile fatalities are huge. And, the benefits of self-driving autonomous vehicles eventually will far outweigh, some of these early issues that we're seeing with Tesla, mm-hmm. in my opinion.
Well, and so I agree with both you guys. I think the interesting thing, people don't recall that when automobiles started to appear on the scene in a mass market type of way in the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of accidents that happened. There was a lot of loss of life, and the industry started to get regulated. The car companies started to get more religion on putting safety features in cars, and it started to get mitigated. So again, I hate I certainly don't want to appear cavalier on it, but I think that when you look at the enormous productivity savings, and to Anshel's point, the massive savings in human life that you're going to see when this gets fully deployed years from now, it will be a positive and good thing for the world. So I really think that all of us can agree on that, and it's just a shame that sometimes things get overblown.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, I'll add one more point. So with
Sure.
respect to 5G, so 5G and IoT is really going to help, bring that full reality of autonomous, driving, to fruition.
Mm-hmm.
You need the telemetry, you need the sensors, in the roads,
Right.
at intersections and that sort of thing to enable that. And that's one of the really, really big use cases for the deployment of 5G, is to support that massive IoT infrastructure. So I think with that maturity, that will become more and more a reality, and a safe reality.
Well, that's a great point. Well, that I think does it for us from a time standpoint. We're at our end here for this week's podcast call. Will and Anshel, thank you for participating in today's call. Thanks to our audience. Please follow Moor Insights and Strategy on social media, on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, the usual suspects. And until next time, have a great weekend. Thanks very much.